The story of Elagabalus, Varius Avitus Bassianus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, goes back to the time of the Roman Republic. Ptolemy V Epiphanes married Cleopatra Syria, princess of the Seleucid Empire. This royal marriage would bring a bond between the Egyptians and the Syrians that would last through the form of a royal priesthood. Ptolemy V was a descendant of Ptolemy I, who was the companion of Alexander the Great, while Cleopatra, a Syrian, was the daughter of Antiochus the Great, who can trace her lineage back to Seleucus, also another general of Alexander the Great. This was all the way back in 200 BCE, which sets us up. And when Pompey the Great conquers the East, he will allow the priesthoods of the Eastern realms to stay in place. For example, Jerusalem, the temple to Yahweh, as well as this Syrian priesthood of Elagabal. And the reason why I bring this up is to set up the setting for Soaemis of Emesa, a member of the royal family, second-born son and child to the priest-king Septimius Severus, who ruled the Emesan kingdom from 14 until 42. He had an older brother named Gaius Julius Adzitzos, who was the first husband of the Herodian princess Drusilla, and had two sisters. Soaemis was born and raised in Emesa. His paternal grandfather was the former Emesan priest king Iamblichus II, who was installed by none other than Augustus. Soaemis married Drusilla, who was none other than the granddaughter of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they had a son named Gaius Julius Alexion. Soaemis, during his reign, was crucial for the Roman Empire because when Titus and Vespasian came to conquer Israel, he was a key ally and aligned himself with the Romans against the Jews. This would allow the priesthood of Elagabal to survive for another century. Which brings us to Julius Bassianus. Julius Bassianus was the high priest of Elgabalus at the Temple of the Sun in Emesa, Syria, where the solar deity was worshipped in the shape of a black stone, which was said to have fallen from heaven. The name Elgabalus derives from Allah, a Semitic word for God, and Gabal, Arab word for mountain, God of the mountain. Bassianus was a member of the royal family, which I just had described, tracing its roots back to the royal families of Ptolemy, Seleucus, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and the Romans knew that this was a real royal priesthood that existed in the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, Bassianus had a daughter named Julia Domna, who married the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus. Julia Domna was so famous and so revered by the Romans, she was deified as Augusta Soteria. In Athens, we have a Greek inscription from 211 of the Common Era. The inscription records a decree of honors granted to her by the Athenians. She is given the title Savior, implying that the decree was in gratitude for some protection accorded to Athens. The surviving sections of the text are concerned particularly with honors that identify Julia Domna with the ancient protective goddess of Athens, Athena Polias. So her full title becomes the Savior of Athens, Julia Sebaste, translated in Latin as Augusta. Here is the translation that we get from Mary Beard. Of her inherent philanthropy, cooperating for all, the savior of Athens, Julia Soaemis, I propose that in all other respects it should be done as my colleague in office, Elagabalus, son of Aedes from Palin, during my absence proposed. All the annual archontes are to sacrifice to good fortune on the most holy birthday of Julia Soaemis Augusta, and to make Cytherea, the savior of Athens, Julia Augusta, Athena Polius, the general over the hoplites, the archon. The day of the month is to be holy, the day on which Athens dedicated the ancient temple to her. The war archon is to sacrifice to the mother of the forces on the first day of the Roman year, and these sacrifices are to be started by the priestess of Athena, and she will receive the prerequisites, and a golden statue of Julia Domna is to be set up in the Parthenon, and the general is to perform the preliminary sacrifice to good fortune in the archontes, and all the priest and the herald are to pour libations, and the priestess and the queen of the king archon are to sacrifice and to offer Asteria of the priesthood of Athena Polias, and retiring Erephori are also to sacrifice and raise the torch and dance at the festival, in order that through these events also our reverence towards the savior of Athens, Julia Soaemis, made be evident. The account of these matters shall be inscribed on a tablet and set up by the altar of the Augustoi on the Acropolis. No woman in the history of the Roman Empire has ever been granted such high deification other than the wife of Augustus himself. She was seen as Athena incarnate and a savioress, a soteria. Now, with that being said, I've just laid out to you there's a royal priesthood that's in Syria that traces its roots back to some of the most famous people in world history, according to the Romans and the Greeks. And we also have a deified woman, Julia Domna. Now, why did I tell you all this? You're looking at the title and saying, what does this have to do with Elagabalus? And when Severus died in 211, Domna became the mediator between their two sons, Caracalla and Geta, who inherited the throne. And she was the actual empress, the most powerful woman, the most powerful person, actually, in the entire Roman Empire. More powerful than Caracalla and Geta. And they were supposed to rule as joint emperors at her command, according to their father's wishes expressed in his will. However, the two young men had a discordant relationship, and Geta was murdered by Caracalla's soldiers in December of that year. Geta's name was then removed from inscriptions and his image erased as a result of the damnation memoria. So, in 217, Caracalla began a new war with Parthia, and Domna went with Caracalla as far as Antioch, Syria. There she stayed helping deal with his correspondence, while he went on to the frontier. During the campaign, Caracalla was assassinated by a Roman soldier. At this point, all of her heirs were gone, her husband was gone, so Domna chose to commit suicide after hearing about the rebellion. Her sister, Julia Mesa, was the grandmother of Elagabalus, Varius Avitus Bassianus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. Caracalla, while in Parthia, was murdered at the behest of one of his bodyguards, Macrinus. Macrinus would be the first Roman emperor to hail himself as Roman emperor without being named as an heir or by being decided by the Senate. Despite his equestrian background, Macrinus was accepted by the Senate for two reasons: for the removal of Caracalla and for having received the loyalty of his legions. The Senate had no choice. However, within a year of his reign, he named his son, Diadumenian, a 9-year-old boy, to be the emperor of the Roman Empire. Macrinus and his son, Diadumenian, are the only two emperors that never would step foot in Rome. They spent their entire reign in the east. And after Macrinus was defeated in the Battle of Antioch in 218, Diadumenian was sent to the court of Artabanus of Parthia to ensure his safety as he was on the run from his revolting legions, led by none other than the main character of this story, Elagabalus. Varius Avitus Bassianus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. And on his way to the court of Artabanus, Diadumenian was found by legions sent by Elagabalus, who also was a young boy himself, 16 years old actually, sent out his legions against a 9-year-old. Just imagine this scene. You have a 16-year-old young boy, priest and a leader of legions, sending out a hit on a 9-year-old boy who's fleeing, who's the Roman emperor. And they found him on his way there. He never actually made it to the court of Artabanus. He was killed on the way there. And now, Elagabalus, who had defeated Macrinus and his son, was now hailed as the Roman emperor. Elagabalus, whose grandmother, Julia Mesa, the sister of Julia Domna, has the royal line, tracing him back to Seleucus and Ptolemy, which was very intriguing for Romans. They loved Elagabalus. He was extremely popular. Here's what Herodian has to say about Elagabalus. And so Macrinus fled from battle. Both armies continued to fight. The bodyguards and spearbearers, whom they call praetorians, fought for Macrinus. These picked men, making a courageous stand against the rest of the army. The remainder of the troops fought for Elagabalus. But when those who were fighting for Macrinus saw neither the emperor nor the imperial emblems for some time, they did not know whether he had been killed or had been fled the battlefield, nor did they know what course they should follow under these circumstances. They had no desire to fight for a man who was absent and were ashamed to surrender. Betrayed, become prisoners of war. Informed by deserters of Macrinus' flight, Elagabalus sent heralds to advise the praetorians that they were fighting vainly for a cowardly fugitive. He solemnly promised them security and amnesty and offered them service as bodyguard. Convinced, the praetorians switched their allegiance. Elagabalus then sent men in pursuit of Macrinus, who by that time had fled for some distance. The fugitive was finally captured at Chalcedon in Bithynia, desperately ill and exhausted by his continuous flight. His pursuers fought him, hiding in the outskirts of the city, and cut off his head. It is said that he was hurrying to Rome, putting his faith in the people's enthusiastic support. But when he attempted to cross over to Europe by the narrow Propontic Gulf and was already close to Byzantium, they say that the wind was against him and carried him back to Asia and his fate. So, by mischance, Macrinus failed to elude his pursuers and met ignoble end a little later while striving to get to Rome, where he should have gone in the beginning. Thus, he owed his downfall equally to bad judgment and bad luck. Such was the fate of Macrinus. With him, his son Diademanius. Now the entire army went over to Elagabalus, proclaiming him emperor, and the youth assumed control of the empire, after affairs in the east had been set in order for him by his grandmother, Julia Mesa, and his advisors, for he was young in years and lacking in education and administrative experience. He delayed his departure for only a short time, and Mesa was eager to return to her familiar imperial life at Rome. The Senate and the Roman people were dismayed at the report of these developments, but submitted through necessity, because the army had elected to follow this course. They attributed the affair to the weakness of Macrinus, and said that he alone was responsible for what had happened. Leaving Syria, Elagabalus proceeded to Nicomedia, where he was forced by the season of the year to spend the winter. Immediately, he plunged into his mad activities, performing for his native god, Elagabalus, the fantastic rites in which he had been trained from childhood. He wore the richest clothing, draping himself in purple robes, embroidered in gold. To his necklaces and bracelets, he added a crown, a tiara glittering with gold and jewels. His dress showed the influence of a sacred robe of the Phoenicians and the luxurious garb of the Medes. He loathed the Greek and Roman garments because they were made of wool, in his opinion an inferior material. Only the Syrian cloth met with his approval. Accompanied by flutes and drums, he went about performing, as it appeared, orgiastic service to his god, Elagabalus. Elagabalus, also known as Deus Sol Invictus, the invincible sun god, oracular deity of Emesa, Syria. His sacred symbol, the conical black stone that fell from heaven. His cult was established in Rome from the later 2nd century. In 218, his hereditary priest at Emesa, Elagabalus, became the emperor. Elagabalus made the god supreme official deity of the empire, with precedence over Jupiter himself. This short-lived promotion, including the translation of the sacred stone to the Palatine, was ended by the assassination of Elagabalus. Although this cult survived to Aurelian and was brought back into the forefront, which means no other than this emperor, Elagabalus, who is the gateway between the traditional pagan Roman religion to the duality that we will later see under Constantine between Sol Invictus and Christianity. Both of those gods come from the East. Obviously, Christianity coming from Judaism. But the Sol Invictus religion has its roots in the Elagabalus rites. Before Elagabalus, Roman religion, as we know it, pretty much stays intact from the time of the Roman Republic through the Augustan regime. During the reign of Augustus, we see a lot of religious reforms, but we still see this pantheon with the Palladian, with Jupiter as the high god, and Dea Roma, Mars, and those are the deities that are traditionally worshipped throughout the Roman Empire up until Elagabalus. And Elagabalus transforms the rites of religion. Here's what the Historia Augusta has to say about the entrance of Elagabalus into Rome. To return to Antonius Varius, having obtained the imperial power, sent messengers to Rome, and all ranks were stirred up, and an immense longing for him was also created among the whole people through the name Antoninus, which seemed to have returned not as a title only, as it had been for Diademinus, but actually in the blood, since he had written what he was the son of Antonius Bassianus, a royal priest from Emesa. He brought with him the reputation that is usually given to the new princeps who follow usurpers, although it does not last except with the highest virtues, and many mediocre princeps have lost it. In short, when Heliogabalus' letter was read in the Senate, at once good wishes were spoken for Antoninus, and curses against Macrinus and his son, and Antonius was acclaimed princeps. All were in favor and eager to believe, as happens with the prayers of men who hasten to believe when they are longing for what they desire to be true. But when he first entered the city to leave out what was done in the provinces, he enshrined Heliogabalus on the Palatine Hill, next to the temple of the emperors, and built a temple for him, being eager to transfer to that temple both the emblem of the mother goddess and the fire of Vesta, the palladium, the sacred shields, and all the objects sacred to the Romans, so that no god should be worshipped at Rome except Heliogabalus. Furthermore, that the religions of the Jews and the Samaritans and the rites of the Christians ought to be transferred there, so that the priesthood of Heliogabalus might include the mysteries of every cult. So if this is true, this would mean that Elagabalus himself, part of the reason why Christianity becomes an accepted religion in Rome. This leads up to Philip the Arab, a few decades later, being baptized and accepting Christianity. Elagabalus was born in 203, Varius Avitus Bassianus, and also given the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus when he became Caesar. There were rumors that he was the son of Caracalla, which isn't true. Elagabalus' family held hereditary rights to the priesthood of the sun god, when Elagabalus himself was the high priest at Emesa in Roman Syria as a part of the Emesan dynasty, the deity's Latin name, Elagabalus. Going back to Herodia, when she saw what Elagabalus was doing, Emesa was greatly disturbed and tried again and again to persuade the youth to wear Roman dress when he entered the city to visit the Senate, referring to his Syrian Phoenician garb. She was afraid that his appearance, obviously foreign and wholly barbaric, would offend those who saw him. They were not used to such garb, and considered his ornaments suitable only for women. But Elagabalus had nothing but contempt for the old woman's warnings, nor did anyone else succeed in convincing him. He would listen only to those who were like him and flattered his faults. Since, however, he wished the Senate and the Roman people to grow accustomed to seeing him in his costume, and wished to test their reaction to this exotic sight, before he returned to Rome, he had full-length portrait painted, showing him performing his priestly duties in public. His native god also appeared in the painting. The emperor was depicted sacrificing to him under favorable auspices. Elagabalus sent this picture to Rome to be hung in the center of the Senate House, high above the statue of Nika, Victory, which each senator burns frankincense and pours libation of wine upon, entering the chamber. He directed all Roman officials who performed public sacrifices to call upon the new god Elagabalus before all others whom they invoke in their rites. By the time the emperor came to Rome, presenting the appearance described above, the Romans saw nothing unusual in it, for the painting had prepared them for what to expect. Elagabalus made the distinction of money customary at the succession of the emperor and staged lavish and extravagant spectacles of every kind. He erected a huge, magnificent temple to his god, surrounded it with numerous altars. Coming forth every morning, he sacrificed there hecatombs of bulls and a vast number of sheep. These he placed upon the altars and heaped up spices of every kind. He also set before the altars many jars of the oldest, finest wines, so that the streams of blood mingled with the streams of wine. Elagabalus danced around the altars to music, played on every kind of instrument. Women from his own country accompanied him in these dances, carrying cymbals and drums, and circled altars. The entire Senate and all the knights stood watching, like spectators at the theater. People were amazed. The spices, the entrails of the sacrificial animals were not carried by serpents or men of low birth. Rather, they were borne along in gold vessels held on high by praetorian prefects and the most important magistrates, who wore long-sleeved robes and a broad purple stripe in the center, robes which hung to their feet in the Phoenician style. On their feet were linen shoes customarily worn by Eastern prophets. It was obvious that Elagabalus was praying to the highest honor, to those associated with him in the performance of the sacred rites. Even though the emperor seemed to be devoting all his attention to dancing and his priestly duties, still he found the time to execute many famous and wealthy men who were charged with ridiculing and censoring his way of life. He married one of the noblest of the Roman ladies, proclaimed her Augusta, but he soon divorced her after depriving her of imperial honors, ordered her to return to private life. So that he might seem to be doing something manly, he made love to one of the Vestal Virgins of Rome, priestesses who are bound by sacred vows to be chaste and remain virgin until the end of their lives. Taking the maiden away from Vesta in the Holy Virgin's quarters, he made her his wife. He sent a letter to the Senate asking to be forgiven for his impious adolescent transgression, telling them that he was afflicted with an overwhelming passion for the maiden. He also informed them that the marriage of a priest and a priestess was both proper and sanctioned. But a short time later, he divorced the girl and took yet a third wife, a girl who belonged to the family of Commodus. Not content with making a mockery of human marriage, he even sought a wife for the god whose priest he was. He brought into his own bedroom the statue of Pallas, which the Romans worship hidden and unseen, even though the statue was not then moved from the time that it was first brought from Troy, except when the temple of Vesta was destroyed by fire. Elagabalus moved it now and brought it into the palace to be married to his god, proclaiming that his god was not pleased by a goddess of war wearing full armor. He sent for the statue of Urania, which the Carthaginians and Libyans especially venerate. This statue, they say, Dido the Phoenician set up at the time when she cut the hide into strips and founded the city of ancient Carthage. The Libyans call this goddess Urania, but the Phoenicians worship her as Astarte, identifying her with the moon. Claiming that he was arranging a marriage between the sun and the moon, Elagabalus sent for the statue and all the gold in the temple and ordered the Carthaginians to provide, in addition, a huge sum of money for the goddess's dowry. When the statue arrived, he set it up with his god and ordered all men in Rome and throughout Italy to celebrate with lavish feasts and festivals, publicly and privately, in honor of the marriage of the deities. In the suburbs of Rome, the emperor built a very large and magnificent temple to which every year in midsummer he brought his god. He staged lavish shows and built racetracks and theaters, believing the chariot races, shows, and countless recitals would please the people, who held night-long feasts and celebrations. Placed the sun god in a chariot with gold and jewels, and brought him out from the city to the suburbs. A 6-horse chariot bore the sun god, the horses huge and flawlessly white, and expensive gold fittings, and rich ornaments. No one held the reins, and no one rode in the chariot. The vehicle was escorted as if the sun god himself were the charioteer. Elagabalus ran backward in front of the chariot, facing the god and holding the horse's reins. He made the whole journey in this reverse fashion, looking up into the face of his god. Since he was unable to see where he was going, his route was paved with gold dust to keep him from stumbling and falling, and bodyguards supported him on each side to protect from injury. The people ran parallel to him, carrying torches and tossing wreaths and flowers, the statues of all the gods, costly or sacred offerings in the temples. The imperial ornaments, valuable heirlooms, were carried by the cavalry under praetorian guard in honor of the sun god. After this, bringing the god out and placing him in the temple, Elagabalus performed the rites and sacrifices described above. Then, climbing to huge lofty towers, which he had erected, he threw down indiscriminately cups of gold and silver, clothing and cloth of every type to the mob below. He also distributed all kinds of tame animals except swine, which, in accordance with Phoenician custom, he shunned. Many lost their lives in ensuing scramble, impaled on the soldiers' spears, trampled to death. Thus the celebration of the emperor brought tragedy to a host of people. Elagabalus was often seen driving a chariot or dancing. He had no desire to sin in secret, but appeared in public with eyes painted and cheeks rubbed, these cosmetics marred to a face naturally handsome. Observing his actions, Emesa suspected that the soldiers were outraged by his eccentricities. Fearing that Elagabalus were killed, she would become a private citizen again. She tried to persuade the youth, who was in every respect an empty-headed young idiot, to adopt as his son and appoint as Caesar, the first cousin and her grandson, the child of her other daughter, Emesa. She told the emperor what it pleased him to hear, that it was clearly necessary for him to have time to attend the worship and service of his god, and devote himself to the rites and revelries and divine functions, but that there should be another responsible for human affairs, to afford him leisure and freedom from the cares of empire. It was not necessary for him, she said, to look for a stranger or someone not a relative, and should entrust these duties to his own cousin. It was then that the name Alexianus was changed to Alexander. The name of his grandfather became Alexander the Great, since the Macedonian was very famous and was held in high esteem, an alleged father of them both. Mesa's daughters, and the old woman too, boasted of their adultery with Antoninus, son of Severus, in order to increase the soldiers' love for the youths, who thus appeared to be Elagabalus' sons. Alexander was then appointed Caesar, and served as consul with Elagabalus himself. Appearing before the Senate, Elagabalus confirmed this appointment, and all the senators voted approval of the fantastic and ridiculous situation they were ordered to endorse, that the emperor, who was about 16 years old, assumed the role of father to Alexander, who was 12. After adopting Alexander as Caesar, Elagabalus undertook to teach him his own practices. He instructed him and dancing and prancing, and enrolling him in the priesthood. Wanted the lad to imitate his appearance and actions. But his mother, Emesa, kept Alexander from taking part in activities so disgraceful and unworthy of an emperor. Privately, she summoned teachers of every subject and had her son trained in lessons of self-discipline, since he devoted himself to wrestling and physical exercise as well. He was, by his mother's efforts, educated according to both the Greek and Roman systems. Elagabalus, much annoyed at this, regretted his decision to make Alexander his son and partner in the empire. He therefore banished Alexander's teachers from the imperial palace. He put to death some of the most distinguished and sent others into exile. The emperor offered the most absurd excuses for doing this, claiming that these men, by teaching Alexander self-control, educating him in affairs, refusing to allow to dance and take part in the frenzied orgies, would corrupt his adopted son. The madness of Elagabalus increased to such a degree that he appointed all the actors from the stage and the public theaters in the most important post of the empire, selecting as his praetorian prefect a man who had from childhood danced publicly in the Roman theater. He elevated similar fashion another young actor, putting him in charge of the education and conduct of the Roman youths, and the qualifications of those appointed to membership in the senatorial and equestrian orders. To charioteers, comedians, and actors of mimes, he entrusted the most important and responsible imperial posts. To slaves and freedmen, to men notorious for disgraceful acts, he assigned proconsular provincial governorships. With everything that had formerly been held sacred being done in a frenzy of arrogance and madness, all the Romans, especially the praetorians, were angered and disgusted. They were annoyed when they saw the emperor, his face painted more elaborately than that of any modest woman, dancing in luxurious robes, effeminately adorned with gold necklaces. As a result, they were more favorably disposed toward Alexander, for they had expected great things of a lad so properly and modestly reared. They kept continual watch upon the youth when they saw that Elagabalus was plotting against him. His mother, Emesa, did not allow her son to touch any food or drink sent by the emperor, nor did Alexander use the cupbearers or cooks employed in the palace, or those who happened to be in their mutual service. Only those chosen by the mother, those who seemed most trustworthy, were allowed to handle Alexander's food. But Emesa secretly distributed money to the praetorians to win their goodwill for her son. It was to gold that the praetorians were particularly devoted. When he learned this, Elagabalus plotted against Alexander and his mother in every conceivable way. But Emesa, the grandmother of both, foiled all his schemes. She was astute in every way and had spent much of her life in the imperial palace. As the sister of Julia Domna, the deified, Emesa had always lived with the empress at the court. Therefore, none of Elagabalus' schemes escaped her attention, for the emperor was careless by nature, and his intrigues were always obvious. Since his plots failed, the emperor undertook to strip Alexander of the honor of Caesar. But the youth was no longer to be seen at public addresses or in public processions. But the soldiers called for Alexander and were angry because he had been removed from his imperial post. Elagabalus circulated a rumor that Alexander was dying, to see how the praetorians would react to the news. When they did not see the youth, the praetorians were deeply grieved and enraged by the report. They refused to send the regular contingent of guards to the emperor and remained in the camp, demanding to see Alexander in the temple. Thoroughly frightened, Elagabalus placed Alexander in the imperial litter, which was richly decorated with gold and precious gems, and set out with him for the praetorian camp. The guards opened the gates, and receiving them inside, brought the two youths to the temple in the camp. They welcomed Alexander with enthusiastic cheers, but ignored the emperor. Fuming at this treatment, although he spent the night in the camp, Elagabalus unleashed the fury of his wrath against the praetorians. He ordered the arrest and punishment of the guards, who had cheered Alexander openly and enthusiastically, pretending that these were responsible for the revolt and uproar. The praetorians were enraged by this order, since they had other reasons also for hating Elagabalus. They wished now to rid themselves of so disgraceful an emperor, and believed too that they should rescue the praetorians under arrest. Concerning this occasion ideal and the provocation just, they killed Elagabalus and his mother Soaemis, for she was in the camp as Augusta. Together with all the attendants who were seized in the camp, and seemed to be his associates and companions in evil, they gave the bodies of Elgabalus and Soaemis to those who wanted to drag them about and abuse them. With the bodies had been dragged throughout the city, and mutilated corpses were thrown into the public sewer that flows into the Tiber. After having ruled the empire for more than 5 years, leading the kind of life described, Elagabalus perished in this manner, together with his mother. The praetorians then proclaimed Alexander emperor and conducted him into the palace while he was still a youth, and still being given a thorough education by his mother and grandmother. That was the fate of Elagabalus. Before I continue with more about Elagabalus, I just want to mention Alexander, his successor, who he named as Caesar. The religion of Alexander was a combination of pagan, Orphic, and Christian beliefs. The Historia Augusta claims that Alexander prayed every morning in his private chapel. He was extremely tolerant of Jews and Christians alike. He continued all privileges toward Jews during his reign. And Alexander placed images of Abraham and Jesus and Orpheus in his oratory, along with other Roman deities and classical figures. When you think of that picture, it's actually not that surprising. This is kind of how most Christians were in this time period. When we look at the old catacombs, the early Christian catacombs, oftentimes you would see images of Orpheus and Abraham and Jesus in the same areas. But I just think it's interesting how we have Roman emperors long before Constantine that are venerating Jesus. Now, to go back to Elagabalus, there are many things written about him from the historians, such as that he wanted to transition into a woman, and that he was willing to give half the empire to anybody who can give him a female genitalia. Cassius Dio states that Elagabalus was married 5 times, and that one of these marriages was to Heracles, which was his chariot driver, and another man named Zoticus, an athlete from Smyrna. Dio also says that Elagabalus prostituted himself in taverns and brothels, and that he delighted in calling himself Heracles' mistress. And he wore makeup, wigs, and preferred to be called a lady and not a lord. It's not quite clear if Cassius Dio is being biased here, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's true either. Nor would I see that as something negative either. But I do think it's interesting that Herodian doesn't talk about any of this, which means there might be some truth in the middle. There's even one story that says that he had so many roses thrown upon his party attendants that they smothered and died. But I think the main thing that I can take away from Elagabalus' reign that shapes the empire that follows him is his religious reforms. He did replace the Roman triad of Jupiter, Dea Roma, and Romulus with Elagabalus, Urania, Astarte. Elagabalus's religious reforms would set up the stage for later religious reforms that came under Aurelian and Constantine. The traditional pagan Rome as we knew it would forever be changed after Elagabalus would never go back again. He died at age 18 in the year 222, and will always be the wonder of the 3rd century.